Hello, everyone. My name is Santiago Guerra. I'm the Subincup Director of the Hulbert Center for Southwest Studies. Thank you for joining us this evening. Uh, Thank you for being with us. We'll be starting in one moment. I quickly want to say that tonight's event, our speaker that we'll be in conversation with tonight, um, this event is really an effort to try to highlight some of the work that's taking place currently on campus at the Fine Arts Center here at Colorado College. And in particular, the Papel Chicano II works on paper from the collection of Chich Marin that's currently on display. It's one of our exhibitions here at the FAC. And I do want to recognize the great work of the curator, Polly Nordstrand, and also all the staff involved with that project, as well as the FAC director, Idris Goodwin. I do want to say today, we'll be using the Q&A function. I have a set of questions that I've developed in collaboration with my colleagues here at Southwest Studies that will guide the conversation. But really, we do hope if you have questions, if you've read Arlene's work, if you have questions about Latinx art, any of these issues, please do use the Q&A function so that we can see if we can't get to those questions. We will have time at the end for that. I do also want to say that because of the great work that today's speaker has done in the areas of Latinx anthropology and really looking at Latinx cultural production, I reached out to my friends and colleagues. And so, you know, in trying to highlight some of the work that the Association of Latinx and Latina Anthropologists is doing, has been doing over the last several years, and is currently doing in terms of raising the voices of Latinx anthropologists. I do want to say that this today's event is in partnership with them. And I do hope we have some ALA members here with us tonight. Now, before we get started for today, ordinarily right now, I'd be doing the land acknowledgement that we've developed here at Southwest Studies to really honor the Indigenous communities in the area where we live and where we thrive and where we learn. But given the circumstances of ongoing events, I wanted to start today by recognizing the horrific crimes that have been ongoing against our Asian American community, and most explicitly the killings that took place in Atlanta earlier this week. And I'm reminded that this last presidency began and ended with the explicit targeting and vilification of marginalized, racialized ethnic communities. And it feels like not too long ago, we were mourning the deaths of our people in El Paso. And it is a reminder that white supremacy is real, that it kills, and that it does not end with a change in administration. It haunts us and it terrorizes us. And so I ask for us to continue to fight this and to stand in solidarity with each other, with our friends, with our families, and that we show up for each other in whatever way we can. Espero que caminemos juntos, and abrazos to all. And now I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and ancestors who lived and survived on the lands where Colorado College and the Hulbert Center is located, particularly the Arapaho, the Apache, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and the Ute, on whose unceded territories Colorado College was founded. And because we live in Zoomlandia now, and Arlene Dávila, our speaker for today, is on the isla, in Puerto Rico, I also wanted to recognize the Taino people and their descendants. And also, in the spirit of that, to make a plug for our colleague Sharina Feliciano Santos' new book, Contested Caribbean Indigeneity, Language, Social Practice, and Identity Within Puerto Rican Taino Activism. And hope that that folks really take a look at and recognize some of the great work being done around Taino identity and Taino heritage. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Arlene Dávila is a recognized public intellectual focusing on questions of cultural equity, and she's a leader in the field of Latinx and critical race studies. A professor of anthropology and American studies at New York University, she's also the founding director of the Latinx Project. She's the author of 6 books, Latino Spain, Latinos Inc., El Mal, Barrio Dreams, so on, that focus on Latinx cultural politics spanning the media, urban politics, museums, and contemporary art markets. And in particular, she does great work looking at all of these processes within global and political economic perspective. If you don't have one of your shelves dedicated to Arlene's work and you're looking at anything around Latinx issues, then you're probably doing it wrong. But today, we do have the great pleasure and honor of having Arlene with us to talk about her newest work, Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and Politics. So Arlene, if you're there and you want to join us to share a brief statement before we go into the Q&A. So welcome, Arlene. Thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you. Let me see if I can figure this out. How do I actually, okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that generous introduction. I guess I'm just old. That's another way to say everything you've said is that I've been around the block, and so honored when I get the opportunity to share new work with new audiences, especially via Zoom. So I wanted to thank you and the Hulbert Center for Southwest Studies, you, Santiago, and all who are joining us today for the opportunity to share some of my work. I speak from San Juan, Puerto Rico. So I want to start by acknowledging the struggle of all Puerto Ricans for self-determination, from an imposed fiscal control board that restricts local sovereignty and favors speculators and developers, and to express solidarity with locals who are demanding equity, social and economic justice on the island and beyond. Now, a lot of my work has been informed by larger social movements, and this one is no different. Latinx art was informed by the Latinx artivist movement for representation in arts, museums, and cultural organizations. And it grew out of my participation in several meetings at the College Art Association and other Latinx conferences where there was young scholars debating the fact that there was no space for Latinx art historians, art scholars. And it was fascinating for me as someone who's been working in Latinx studies for a while to see the dearth of scholarship in art history. When we think about literature, when we think about history, when we think about ethnography, there are by now a good solid amount of work so that we can refer to these fields as having trajectories. So students that are situated in literature, cultural studies, and history can find themselves and find literatures. Yet in art history, there was a huge marginalization, a dearth of knowledge. And that's actually what young people, scholars, art historians, students were debating, particularly the lack of spaces for them to explore Latinx studies, the lack of faculty within their departments and all of that. I personally had started my career in the arts like 30 years ago. I actually started my work in Museo del Barrio, Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, institutions that actually were so central to the New York art movement and to the legacy of Latinx art in New York City. And I had seen either disappear due to lack of funding, as the case of MOCA, or transforming themselves and transforming their missions to appeal to the taste of boards and wealthy patrons in ways that actually had led to the marginalization of Latinx artists. I'm old enough to have lived through the so-called Hispanic art decade or the Latin American art boom, and see how that rise of attention within these so-called booms had led to and had been accompanied by the marginalization of Latinx artists. So the book kind of, I felt like I had to write this book because I was seeing and I was witnessing, but I also had the historical perspective and also my background with issues of the economy, analyzing the political economy of culture, to be attentive to analyzing larger trends, economic trends, cultural trends that were impacting the marginalization of Latinx art. I also felt that because my livelihood did not depend in the arts, I was able to be situated in the perfect space to actually intervene and write about these issues in a way that didn't compromise my background or identity, because I didn't depend on the art world. Therefore, I was able to talk about topics like racialism, the market, or racism in the arts in a way that that more freely than others who may find themselves um, uh, more vulnerable by bringing about these issues. So the result actually is a book that I tell people is a book that anybody else that I could have written about could have written. Anyone that I interview would have been able to write if they had had the opportunity in terms of time, because I'm not saying anything that nobody else, none of the artists, curators, or stakeholders that I spoke to do not know. These are things that I had been hearing for a while and that everybody told me forever, that seeks to expose the formal script of what people say in the art world with the informal script of what people also say in the art world, the racist dynamics behind the devaluation of Latinx art. And in particular, I ask a very simple question, which is, how is it possible that Latinx people, who make up 18% of the total population, remain so invisible in mainstream US museums where they're not even recognized as American artists? In particular, I show how the invisibility of Latinx artists affects our ability to achieve the more equitable and diverse contemporary art world and a more inclusive and just society. And in the few minutes before we start the conversation with Santiago, I just want to share 3 takeaways for those who have not read the book about what you will find when you open the book. First is an exploration of the extent to which racism operates in the art world. One of the most important revelations during my research was learning how few people actually understood who and what Latino, Latinx people are in the mostly white spaces of the art world, where there were so few people of color and where the industry worked as an exclusive, isolated bubble, despite operating in some of the most demographically diverse cities in the United States, as in New York City, where close to 30% of the population is Latinx. People, whenever I brought up the subject, would be confused and would mention the Latin American artists they work with. Or some people even said, oh, well, we have to go to Los Angeles to find them, as if there was no Latinx people in New York City. Second takeaway was how much race and identity are sources of value and evaluation in the art world, contrary to the dominant art positionality, which states that art should be seen, considered, studied, and valued irrespective from any identity or cultural consideration. A perspective that, as we know, favors whiteness, white artists who are not marked racially or ethnically. So the key element here is that this positionality erases how much race and ethnicity are centrally involved in these determinations of value. The issue that I show and I seek to explore is that some identities are more valued than others. Some are believed to have more purchased, are seen as more marketable, more commodifiable than others, which are racialized. As a result, who is involved in making determinations around collecting, exhibiting, selling artworks really matters. That's why I bring the concept of national privilege to sort of think about the nationalist dynamics behind the evaluation of Latin American art, global art, international artists over minoritized artists, and in the case that I study, Latinx artists. So one of the things that I argue and I show is that whereas Latin American and Latinx art are both subordinated categories in the art world, there's a lot more structures, collectors that have lifted Latin American art to the extent that we do have a category that is more evaluated, yet you have not seen the same with in regards to Latinx artists, hence the importance of creating those spaces. And I would love to talk about what we're doing at the Latinx Project at NYU, which is very much informed by this project and really has galvanized me to really highlight the importance of creating spaces of evaluation of Latinx art, culture, and history, not only in museums, but in universities and any other evaluating institution, like universities, museums, archives, and so forth. The second takeaway is the importance of analyzing the Latinx art movement and analyzing Latinidad as a project, not as a static identity. One of the most exciting lessons was learning about the works of so many artists I interviewed and how central it was for them to uplift marginalized identities within Latinidad, Afro-Latinidad, Indigenous Latinidad, non-normative challenging gender normativity. And I thought it was fascinating because, in fact, whereas Latinx is increasingly being used more and more, in the art world, it was very much used by a lot of the artists I interviewed, far more than scholars and regular people. And I thought it was fascinating to see how in tuned artists were in kind of peeling the onion, in kind of echoing a new project of Latinidad, which is very different than perhaps that of Latino identities, perhaps 10 years ago, that was really about highlighting similarities and pan-ethnicities. But this one project that, as we know, by just listening and being in tune what's happening with Twitter and everyday life and our students, is really about highlighting the identities that have been marginalized and peeling and challenging the homogeneity that is assumed. And that means exploring and exposing differences as a central project of what Latinx, what the X means. So I will leave it at that now, because I know that Santiago has a lot of other questions, but I'm delighted to delve deeper into all of the things I've said so far.
Thank you, Arlene. That was that was a great intro. I think I given the the body of work that you've produced and the great contributions you've made to Latinx cultural studies, and I think to anthropology more broadly, I was hoping that you could expand a little bit on your own approach, perhaps even how it's changed for this project, like your theoretical methodological approach, and why you think it's significant, given that there, as you mentioned, there is a sort of marginalization of Latinx art within art history. Why is bringing either an ethnographic lens, a cultural studies lens, anthropological approach, why is it so significant to the work that you were able to do with this project?
I mean, I know you're an anthropologist, and we were talking before we started about how, how critical we are about the discipline. And I don't know how many anthropologists have logged in, but I have always been very open about how the work I do is not at all informing anthropology. It's informed by critical ethnic studies. And in fact, this book that I've written, if I would not have read the work of African-American BPOP writers and Chicanx scholars, I'm thinking, the work of Laura Perez, Karen Dávalos, Mabel Wilson, Bridget Crooks, English Darby. Those are the people that kind of, so I think it's very important, I always feel like I'm too old to be kind of fetishizing disciplines and methodologies, but for sure, as we know, anthropology has not worked in Latinx studies, and that's kind of changing. And I know there's a lot of exciting new generations, and I want to give a shout out to a book that's going to be coming out very soon, that it's edited by Gina Perez and Alex Rivera, who actually highlights Latinx anthropology. But our generation is informed by the critical, Chicanx, Patricia Zavala, and some of the other. I guess I'm just going in circles to say that I don't want to, ever claim that this book, it's not anthropology that informed me. It was cultural activists, in fact. People like Marta Vega, who's a cultural equity guru and activist. So it was really that kind of being very in tune with what activists were doing, and then trying to realize that in the literature of our history, or the literature on markets, here Patricia Banks and other African-American sociologists, very important to my thinking, realizing the dearth of literature analyzing people of color in the art world. And then trying to read what had been written about this, and then finding that it's primarily African-American scholars and very few Chicanx writers that have written about this. So, but yes, the ethnographic lens. So I prefer to talk about ethnographic lens rather than anthropological lens, right? Because as we know, ethnography as a methodology, it's so used by, critical ethnic studies scholars, by cultural studies, by so many people beyond, right? And also the type of ethnography I do is also not the traditional anthropological ethnography, because it's not really looking down, it's looking up, right? It's studying power. It's really analyzing the, going to galleries, going to art fairs, trying to analyze and look up to the agents that have the power to shape the conversation and to shape identities and to shape value, right? So that is really central. But in particular, I think that, yes, that ability to sort of like, as somebody said, she just wrote a book filled with gossip, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted,
Mm-hmm.
was to basically expose what we all talk about, but
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes deny, right? Oh, that's not how things are. I just show receipt after receipt and evidence after evidence of how actually these artists are racialized, in what ways, how do people talk about them, how do galleries talk about them, how are they misunderstood, how they are misconstrued, how they're stereotyped. I put it out there, but right,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the beauty of the ethnographic method, is that it really provides the intricate proof, right, to attest and provide evidence to what oftentimes in spaces of power most people deny. Oh, well, this artist is just great because they're just great, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, well, this artist is just great because they have a whole institutional backing behind them, right? So absolutely, I think that that's perhaps one of the most useful things of the ethnographic method, is to really provide the substance, right, the materiality, to basically prove what we all know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes white supremacy wants to deny is real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's as you've highlighted. I also do want to say that the Hulbert Center for Southwest Studies did host the group that you're talking about almost a year
Wonderful.
ago to work on the revision of that body of work that's going to be out hopefully soon and really great. But I do think what you highlight is important, right? That ethnography is an approach that allows you, right? If we're saying, here is this group of artists, a population that's invisibilized, right? How can you use a method like ethnography, an approach like you're saying, the approach of ethnic studies scholars, to really bring out the voices of this marginalized artist population into visibility, right? And I think that's the great thing about this book, is you're hearing the voices of these artists, right? You're seeing how they operate in this place that in many ways is not necessarily accepting of them, or really trying to bring them in any significant way. So I think it's a really important work, not just for folks looking at Latinx studies, but people that are interested in how the art world, like you're saying, marginalizes particular populations because they're deemed as less valuable, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So my next question, you really sort of highlighted in your opening remarks the project of Latinidad, right? How and in many ways you've also been able to trace how that's changed over time, right? How now in a current generation with our students, with young activists, the understanding of Latinx identity and Latinidad is really moving into new directions. And in particular, you cite an artist like early on that says, Latinx is a term of entry, not a term of closure, which I thought was like the best way, I think, to start a conversation around Latinidad. So I was just hoping you could speak more about the significance of Latinidad as you've seen it transform over, the time that you've done work on Latinx identity, but also in particular, like you were saying, how artists are. It seems like they're bringing something very new and different to the table when we're talking about issues of identity, Latinx cultural production, all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all of us learn from students, and I wouldn't say we also learn from. I feel like artists are always kind of a little bit ahead, and I hate saying that because it kind of fetishizes that artists are ahead, but there is something to be said about they're being in tune with also a lot of the artists I talked to were younger too, but I think it's so important to realize, this conversation around labels, that, no labels make sense unless we center white supremacy. And you kind of said that in your remarks at the beginning, right? Is that, a lot of people have this debate about like how to call ourselves. I'm like, we have to center white supremacy that anchors US, whiteness as normativity. And then it would always find ways of racially mark others. And in that kind of game of marking others, right, you have had Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx, Latin American, any kind of label, right, has been a product of both racialization, right, because of how people defined us, but also how the community seeks to define itself or also organize itself to challenge that racialization. And I don't think that any of these labels, right, are free of exemption, because they're products of racial projects, right? They will always be contentious. And there will always be debates about what is the right category or for whom, in what context, because they're historically social, cultural products, they change. And I'm pretty sure that, pretty soon we're going to come up with another label, right? My hunch is that when Latinx doesn't do the work it does now, when Latinx continues to be as co-opted, as whitewashed, as Latino, Latina, right, became, I will be the first one to say, let's go back, find another label, right? That makes us for a moment, right, think ahead and like not take ourselves for granted, right? That's what I feel Latinx is doing. Latinx makes us think, oh, wait, where are our trans community? Hey, where are issues of racial inclusivity? And where are the other communities that feel uncomfortable with that label, right? So that's why it's a point of entry, because once you begin to ask, what is that? You begin to highlight, right, about the indigenous community or Black Latinx community and all of the other categories that, in Latino projects in the past, there didn't seem to be room for them. So I always feel like, I'm a Gramscian at heart. It's kind of social movement, hegemonic, right? Social projects, right? And that understanding of Latinidad as a social project, and when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, which is ultimately fight white supremacy and ultimately create more inclusive spaces for all of our identities to be expressed, then, we should come up with a different label, because that identity would be tied to a social project, right? That's just the thing. It's like the meaning of any of these labels is not static, right? And they will change when the project changes, That's why Latino, Latina nowadays fall flat. They fall flat because there's a social movement that says, what happened to the trans community, right? Because people began to say, hey, Latinidad is that kind of, Telemundo look that doesn't look like us. So that's what's so exciting about the moment we're in, and why it's so important to know that new labels are to be welcomed, only because they signal, right, response to a previous cooptation. And they signal that there's a new project emerging. So bring them on. Let's not be scared of them, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a, what you've said right now, and what Ronnie Quevedo, the artist, sort of highlights is that as opposed to closing ourselves off to these conversations, that we need an entry point, and this can be the entry point for refining our understanding of each other as a community, and also, the different subpopulations that make us up, whether it's by national origin.
Absolutely. I mean, right now, one of the most exciting things about the Latinx movement is how it's making us nervous about the fact that Latinidad's got to go. How awesome is that? Yeah. It gives us the opportunity to think about, hey, the Salvadorian community needs to be at the table. Hey, what happened with, Afro-Latinx? Why isn't it, like these kinds of questions that break Latinidad are a welcome thing, because it makes us healthier. It makes us realize that Latinidad has become a whitewashed tool, and a tool for erasing our differences. And then that's a good thing. And it's fascinating, because in this conversation, I find like oftentimes a lot of the people that are like like trying to protect Latinidad are people that are doing Hispanic marketing, right? They're so afraid of that they will lose their market value if they, you know, like I'm like, anyways, let me know. Go on.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, and since you've done, you know, previous work on that issue around, like you're saying, the whitewashing of the Latinx population for, you know, economic purposes, for marketing, for consumption, all these things, right? It makes sense that there's some pushback to that in the current moment with a younger generation of individuals that, you know, is questioning all these things in a really profound way, right?
Absolutely.
I think the follow-up that I have for this also is, you know, you brought up the point of Salvadoran having a seat at the table in these discussions, and it reminds me of a moment in the text where Central American artist talks about being U.S. based, but also having this sort of strong affinity to this sort of country of origin through her ancestry. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to this relationship between, that you've already sort of mentioned in your opening remarks, between Latin American identity and Latinx, like US based Latinx identity, and how the art world is understanding that, but also how it, I don't know, how it muddles the picture for either outsiders or even those of us ourselves in Latinx community.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good one, right? Because, you know, when you read my book, a lot of people are like, oh, Arlene, you're drawing a distinction between Latinx and Latin American art. And I'm like, well, yes, I am, so that we could begin to rescue, understand, and stop marginalizing Latinx artists. Not because hemispheric and global and movements and flows between Latinx and Latin America are not important to analyze. And I think that that's kind of the key of the matter. I feel like in the past 10 years, we have had so much emphasis to hemispheric approaches and globalization in theory, in literature, in cultural studies, and flows and movements, that we have fetishized that as a real thing and forgotten to really analyze how identities function on the ground, right? And how, right, there are institutional spaces creating, reifying, and commodifying and marking, right, categories, right? And that's kind of key, you know, in particular in relationship to Latinx art. You have had that the whole Latin American boom was the result of elites, embassies, national institutes, right, that began to collect, support, uphold, and had an interest in Latin American art. And when I'm talking about Latin American art, I'm talking about a very particular white-centric, Western-centric, geometric, you know, based on the taste of particular collectors. And that's the first thing that we need to highlight, this idea of Latin American art. You know, maybe is very exclusive, right? If when you look at it, it's like maybe artists from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, period. And then all of this, and that's Latin America. No, we need to begin to unpack, right, the incredible exclusions and racism that has shaped the category of Latin American art, so that you do not have Black Latin American artists represented, artists from many countries, El Salvador being one, but also why it is that you have Brazil, but you don't have Haiti, right? So there's so many problems with the category of Latin American art, right? Particularly around themes, you know, indigenous, where are the indigenous artists? You know, where are the Black Latin American artists? But then on top of that, what you see is that conversation and that dominance of Latin American art in institutions, in auction houses, collectors endowing chairs of Latin American art in major museums, collectors endowing chairs of Latin American art in major universities, collectors endowing collections, and all that infrastructure just has never existed for Latinx art, because Latin American elites never care about Latinx art, because Latinx art was always, like somebody said, you know, something from the ghetto. I think of the people that clean my house. There's incredible racialization going on. And you see it in the context of Mexican art vis-a-vis Chicanx art, Puerto Rican art with New Rican art, and the whole category of Latin American art with Latinx art. So unless we begin to anchor the differential evaluations that have uplifted Latin American art, so that right now you have a lot of people graduating and people, like, in fact, a lot of the US Latinx Art Forum colleagues who that I talked about, all of them, had professors that did, Latin American art, or they themselves have been trained in Latin American art and never had a class on Latinx art. I mean, these gaps are real. By the way, they're gap in academia, right? Too, they're familiar. These gaps are familiar. So I think that it's important. So that's all I say. It's like, it's great that, we have studies that highlight hemispheric and global approaches. They anchor empire, they anchor circulation, all of that. But we need to be realized about the incredible inequities in the institutional structures, right? That have made invisible Latinx art, on the idea that, right, that if you hire a Latin American collector, if you hire a Latin American museum person, which is what happened, our Latinx communities had to quedarse calladitas because they somehow are supposed to be expert on us. This is a huge problem because when you go to Latin America, you don't see Latinx people anywhere. You don't see Latinx artists in the collections. You don't see them taking jobs anywhere. So it's a big, real disengagement of that has to do with the exclusive art worlds and racial and class exclusive art worlds of Latin America that are super elitist, that are not, so when I talk about Beatriz, my goodness, the Salvadorian artist, I forget the last name right now. She's a very good example because she's an artist, right? That is a Salvadorian, but also located in United States. And I wanted to highlight that, of course, many artists do that, but the kind of hemispheric approaches that artists like hers are anti-racist hemispheric approaches. They're not the global, right, Latin American art worlds of the cosmopolitan elites that are fueling the art world. Because I didn't want to fetishize this idea that transnational perspectives and migratory exchanges are not important to Latinx artists, but rather, right, that we need to be very careful about how we begin to theorize, right, artists that are born, raised, or that work primarily in the context of the United States, whose trajectories are very informed by their experience as racial others in solidarity with movements of anti-racism in the United States and across the Americas, right? And I wanted to rescue that space. I also wanted to reject this formula, this idea that Latinx art can only be analyzed in relationship to Latin American art, which is one of my biggest pet peeves. The fact that now for 20 years now, you have had that any Latinx has to be Latinx and Latin America. Like, why? Why not African American? Like the fact is that our communities, Latinx communities, right, are nourished by, live in multi-ethnic communities, and you don't have conversations because you have this formula that seeks to link Latin American artists, many of them from elites in Latin America, that have to be linked with our Latinx communities. And I think it's important that we begin to generate a conversation where Latinx art is seen as American art. And it is seen in the context of the United States with any other group or any other movement, right? Not only in terms of the hemispheric conversation that is legible to particular curators that oftentimes want to force it because many of them are trained in Latin American art, and then they have to link Latinx. So in my dream, imagine if we could have Latinx art as the center from which we could then establish conversations, whether they are with Latin America or with the world, right?
Yeah, no, I think, highlighting, as you're saying, the subject position of Latinx people in the US becomes real significant to see how all these other, how international political economy operates to marginalize Latinx people in the US and also in their countries of origin or where their ancestral countries are.
Absolutely.
And I think even just as we've seen more and more scholars within Latinx studies turning their scholarly view towards Latin America and doing really great work using their subject position from the US to,
so important.
I think of your work in Culture Works. I think of Maurice Magaña's work in Oaxaca, Alex Chavez's work in Mexico,
Marisol Lebron in Puerto Rico.
Marisol Lebron, Puerto Rico.
By the way, it's Beatriz Cortés. I don't want her to hear, she couldn't remember your last name, which I think I think she's just so powerful. And so such a great example, right, of an artist who is transnational, right? and how great it would be to have Latinx transnationalisms, but not reduced to the way in which the Latin American art world defines those hemispheric conversations.
Yeah, definitely. So we've been talking about or tiptoeing around these issues of like markets and politics. So I was hoping you can talk a little bit more about these sort of influences from market pressures, like you're saying, the emphasis on, or the marginalization of Latinx artists and the type of artistic content they're producing, and also how politics sort of get involved into those sort of like market responses from collectors, from museums, exhibitions, all these things. Like what is it about politics that influence the markets and vice versa?
Yeah, well, as you know, I've always been interested in the forces of the market as something we need to analyze, because it is, we live in a neoliberal economy and we need to analyze the forces of the market in shaping identity, shaping evaluation. And, one of the things I hope people take away when they read my book is how made up value is. And how important it is to fetishize this idea of artistic, right? Of artistry. And, the market is so central here, right? The fact that nowadays collectors, right, can shape conversations around acquisitions, that collectors are part of boards, museum boards that define the collections, that they can donate works. I think one of the best examples here is the Cisneros donation of Latin American art to MoMA. A whole huge thing. It's all her taste, geometric abstraction. And if you go there and you look at that huge, it's like I think over almost 90 something pieces. And you would think that that's Latin American art. How terrible is that collectors can shape, right, the definition of, right? And that's what happens everywhere. Any kind of ism, minimalism, whatever, where, collectors and the taste of particular elites of upholding particular movements and artists as the definition of, and then one collector, another collector, everybody wants to buy the same thing. And then, that's why we have this bubble with African American art right now, right? Because all of those artists were amazing. They were amazing forever, right? They were amazing then, and they were amazing now. But now people are like discovering them, looking back, right, to what they missed out, right? Creating yet another bubble. But the fact is that is just an example of so many, right? So many instances of artists who are devalued, and how, the market creates those kinds of, right, trends, and how important it is for us to recognize those trends as created by the particular taste of collectors, and then they're just as made up as anything else. And it's, so I could go on and on, but I think that's why it's so important to have Latinx artists, scholars, curators in these institutions, because it really matters, right? When they can be central to the conversation around acquisitions, when they can be directing, right, the conversation, and when they, and also more of us, of our community, collecting, but not collecting because, collecting has a kind of like, possessive investment, colonial roots, but, like in, supporting our artists, many of us, there's so many artists that we know, like it's important that our community also begins to create that value, right?
Yeah.
Not just leave it to which is what's happening now, at the top of this market, that you have white collectors, right, purchasing or collecting now the trends of people of color, African Americans, Latinx. So I'm very critical of the market. At the same time, that I hope that when people read the book, they realize the importance of hopefully my book will inspire more in our community. We need more people to deal work, to sell work, to represent artists, right? That's another thing, many of our artists don't have representation, and also many of our artists need to empower themselves to sell their work, right? And there's a lot there. I think that it's important to realize the space as a key element of cultural equity and cultural participation and economic participation. And that more of us should be part of it, as opposed to just and break away the exclusive centrality and monopoly of, like, few people on the know, because that's just BS and made up, and leads to exclusions and leads to very boring art worlds.
Yeah, no, definitely. I do want to remind the audience out there that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We have one that's come in, but if we can get some more for the last few minutes that we'll have. Given that response that you just gave, Arlene, I think it's a really great segue to talk about the fact that we have some of Chichmarin's collection here at our museum, right? Because here you have one of these examples you're talking about, this Chicano, actor that made it in many ways a mission of his to start to collect the work of these Chicano artists. The thing that I wanted to ask you about is, like, here you have an example of the type of potential market project, right? To value the work of, in this case, Chicanx artists. But then there's also a thing that's come up as the collection's been here, that's like, oh, there's no real work by Chicanx artists from Colorado, right? So
exactly.
But Cheech has a particular taste, likely, that's informing that. So I just wanted to hear a little bit of your thoughts about that, right? When Latinx collectors or investors are also creating a market, if there's space to have it be more expansive, more inclusive.
Absolutely.
Like that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm so excited about that project, and I hope that now that it becomes a thing, it becomes more open, right? Because it started with Chi's vision, right? And he's got their own taste. So hopefully when it becomes a thing, and it has an artistic director and it has scholars involved, you could have conversations around, hey, maybe we need to have more contemporary artists, or maybe we need to have artists from Colorado, or open up the conversation on Chicanx also to other not Chicano communities, but right, communities. So absolutely, but it's a very good example, right? Why it is that we only have Chichmarin, right?
Yeah.
Like, why? Like, that's a big issue, right? When you have, especially in the African American community, so many collectors, and we need to begin to do that. Chichmarin did an amazing job, incomplete because it's not, but our collections are. But in the context of this museum, yes, you're going to have, and I'm very excited about the Latino Museum that's going to open up. That's going to be another awesome moment for us to begin to say, hey, who's not, and also how central it is that scholars are here, right? Because when you have institutions collecting, then you have scholars guiding that, not collectors. Like, I like this. No. We have scholars that say, hey, you need to have this particular moment was important. These artists were key. Let's find it. Let's go and excavate, which is actually what the curators right now at the Latino, at the Smithsonian, like Carmen Ramos, Taina Garacol are doing, right? Which is, that's what I would love to see more of, right? Rather than within the context of a market, when you have a collection that's stuck and then you have the limits of it. But for now, I think it's fantastic that what Chichmarin has done, and I hope that it inspires more people to do their own collections, And I think it's also important to think small, maybe collect Nuyorican art, or maybe collect graphic arts, or maybe collect, feminist, whatever, or urban issues, whatever it is. But I think all of us, right, are collectors in one way or the other, you know, and to just, just have fun without, forget about that, not have fun. But the issue is really appreciate, right? Really appreciate our community, and also the fetishize this idea of the art, because, I wrote about visual arts because it's the market, but there's so many, popular arts, right? Folk arts, crafts, right? and also music. And I don't know, I just think that our community has a lot of history and needs to be archived, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need to begin to by evaluating. I just came from the memorial of one artist. His name is Nestor Otero, and he was very active in the New Yorker arts movement. And I had the chance to visit his home, and he had the most important archival collection of newspaper invitations and clippings of all the work that people did back in the 70s and 80s, you know.
Mm-hmm.
None of that exists, you know. That's such an important archive, you know, the actual, you know, the invitations, the all of these institutions before computers, right? Before, and it was there. He had like piles and piles and piles, and we're going to need that, you know, when we have this Latino museum, we're going to need to go back to, right, all of our communities and recover all that material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think, and also like, you know, one thing, especially when lots of folks only recognize Chis Marin as the guy from all the weed movies or anything like that, to know what a profound impact, right, he's had on at least the Chicanx arts community through this sort of work that a lot of people actually don't recognize him for, right? They see him and they think of the Up in Smoke movies, smoking weed, all these things. And so so I think your call for most folks to be involved in the process of collection and supporting Latinx art is an important call, right? We have gotten a lot of questions. I guess people took my call a little seriously. One of the first questions was about the audience. I think you've talked a little bit about this already, but someone's wondering what the goals of this work in particular are, like if you're hoping that curators pick this up, if you're hoping.
Absolutely. I'm hoping this book makes it easy for younger generations to write about this topic without having to explain what Latinx art is. Right? Just that will make me happy. And I know a lot of people are very happy because of the confusion with Latinx and Latin American art. I think that I try to go there, and I hope that, you know, it just illuminates. And I know a lot of people in the art world are using it that way. So that's all. That's my very humble thing, is that it helps anyone to and uplift and say, hey, this exists, this is a real thing, and this is why it's different, this is why you need to think about this. That's, you know, and I'm very happy that the people that have read it include people in the art world, in museums, whatever, but also people in anthropology, in cultural studies, in the economy. I walked to a gallery that was exhibiting the Latinx artists, and they showed me the book, and they were using it to kind of like, hey, look, you should buy this work because it's valuable. I don't care how you use it, but it's obvious that, you know, like, wow, this is legitimating something. And that to me is an important thing, right? That kind of like, this exists, this is real. Our community's here, right? In a space where we were so invisible, and we remain so invisible.
Yeah, I think also one of the follow-ups to that is somebody's asking where you see your research moving, if it's staying in the Latinx art context. And you talked about the Latinx Project at NYU, how that's evolving.
Yeah, you know, like I joke that, you know, I love writing and researching, but right now my new project is the Latinx Project, right? I mean, I'm old enough, you know, I've been around the block, you know, I've written 6 books, so I don't know if I want to write more. But I think what I'm doing right now is opening up, creating this space, because I don't want to live in a university that doesn't have Latinx studies. And I think many of us who are my generation are tired of being in institutions where there's no Latinx studies resources. And right now I'm dedicating my next years to ensuring that there's an infrastructure so that new generations of students, grad students, and faculty members are not homeless in university campuses. And I'm hoping that many more people like copy the Latinx Project and are inspired to the Latinx Project, Latinx Project Colorado, Latinx Project. I don't, you know, the important thing is that we need to create spaces in these institutions. And that's what I'm hoping I'm doing. And it may not lead to a book. Hopefully it will lead to something that is sustainable. That would make me very happy, even if I don't write another book.
Yeah, well, even you back in December, you wrote an op-ed about the National Latino Museum, right? so I think this work and the work at NYU is having an impact, at least in the national conversation around.
I hope so.
Right.
I think that we're this debate that, is ethnic studies, is Latinx studies too narrow? It's like, I'm so tired of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to, Latinx studies is so rich,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so much, right? So much that we need to, and we need to have resources. So our community, we're inspired in creating this, and I hope that my dream would be that we have Latinx projects or Latinx Institute, Latinx centers in most universities, and if they want to be called Chicanx, Puerto Rican, New Rican, Dominican, whatever, but that there has to be something where in universities, we can't afford to remain invisible.
Yeah, and I think being able to highlight the significance, as you're saying, of Latinx people, but also Latinx studies, right? In the different, whether it's Boricua studies, Chicanx studies, Central American studies, all these contributions that several of our colleagues have been making around a whole range of academic sort of topics and issues. We do have a question about, we've been talking a little bit about the silencing of particular experiences within Latinidad, and you've talked a little bit about the shift over the last decade, but someone's wondering what specific lived experience you notice are still most silenced in these Latinx conversations.
Silence in Latinx conversations. Well, always, right? Conversations around race, conversations around multi-diverse identities, even though Latinx, right, I feel is opening up that space. That's a space that needs to be central to that conversation. So I think that's, we're at a moment when, as I said, we need to be really central in highlighting, do we have Black Latinx faculty? Does your university have Indigenous Latinx faculty? I think it's very important to get there, to really talk about issues of race and racism in Latinx studies, because we haven't had that conversation, not only in terms of, hiring people in Afro-Latinx studies, but also ensuring that our Latinx studies faculty, right, is diverse, ethnically diverse, racially diverse. Yeah, I mean, I would love to be in a position to, at NYU, for instance, we really need to hire Afro-Latinx studies faculty. That's why we started the Afro-Latinx Fellowship, which, will be the second year next year. But that, and also we don't have Central American studies at NYU. That's another big miss, right? And also, not to only think about Afro-Latinx studies, it's like such a diverse field, right? Because, you have like, so I think it's, in terms of genres, disciplines, backgrounds. So I think we have a lot of work to do in maturing this conversation, not only in saying, oh, there's Afro-Latinx studies, but in really hiring and transforming the way that our discipline looks like, right?
Yeah. We have another question from Nadia Jesus, a colleague here at Colorado College, who's was particularly interested in the comment that you made early on about your positionality, about not being sort of not being impacted by any sort of critiques you might make in the art world because you weren't an artist or a curator, right? So that in some ways you are marginal to the art world, that any of these critiques wouldn't have a negative impact on your career, things like that. But what she's wondering is if you consider yourself an artist, and if you think that this book would have been written differently if it stemmed from a more embodied experience of art making.
Oh, absolutely. An artist would have written it very different. And I am so not an artist. Actually, no, I had a conversation with an artist who told me all of us who create something from scratch are artists. So all of us who write books, right? It's like you got that, and I was like, wow, that is so true, right? the ability to create something from scratch, understanding that force creativity force. So yes, I'm going to claim my artist hat today for that. But the technique, the what artists, the different formats, my goodness, never. Very humble at the kind of work discipline, right? And to appreciate the care with and the difficulty of writing, right? If we can begin to theorize the difficulty of writing with the difficulty of art making, right? It's such a great way of gaining humbleness to what artists, to the work of being an artist, right? So, but yeah, what I was able to say is that, I'm a tenure professor, so I don't need to worry about insulting a curator, or they're not going to put me in their exhibition. They're going to attack me a troublemaker. They're going to attack me. And that was a key element in these spaces, how there is the kind of docility that people expect of you if you're an artist, right? They want you to, which has a lot to do with the marginalization of labor of art, right? That you're supposed to do your art, but then let people make money out of it. So if you are seen as too outspoken or too empowered, there was a sense of docility about who you want to work with and who you don't want to work with. And I mean, I could write a lot more about that. I didn't, but absolutely, there was this fear. A lot of people who said they didn't want to say things out loud, or a lot of people, artists who would say, thank you, Arlene, for raising that. Like, I knew there were things that I could say because of, I didn't have to depend on that positionality. That's kind of what I meant. Yes. Thank you for that question, though.
Another question was, given the significant financial and real estate barriers to launching a Latinx owned or run gallery, did you encounter or envision any more collective oriented or mutual aid organizing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And also internet, Instagram. I think it's so important what people are doing nowadays in Instagram, that, in terms of promoting their work. And one of the things that I did in the book was I have this appendix, right? Where I have some of the people that are kind of Instagram promoters, right? And they're doing such an amazing work, right? Actually, in the Latinx Project, one of the things that we did, and this is one of the team members' idea, was why don't we do a collection of all the artists we've exhibited? And there's now there's going to be a tab with all the artists we've exhibited, and there's quite a number of them. So how amazing if people know, oh, if you want to know about artists, they have a website where they have a lot of artists. So I think that the Instagram world, that actually I have seen the difference that it makes. Some of the artists that we have shown have been picked up by other curators that didn't know about them. I have seen the difference that it makes when you have a space of visibility. Even one gallery picked up an artist, for representation for, to do a show. Like, it matters, right? To be visible. So, and in terms of the real estate, I think one of the things that I've seen the latest is this kind of itinerant pop-up spaces, whereby the galleries have kind of a Instagram or online thing, and then they would rent for periodic, instead of having it, right? They would rent to have shows, right? In spaces that actually are not static, right? Depending on the opportunity, there are itinerant spaces. So there are new trends, there are new that people are using to circumvent that challenge. But I think that the world of Instagram and virtual world, and it's opening up conversations, and I think it's an exciting moment. Because of that.
Yeah. And one final answer, I'm going to take the last question that's here and try to mix it with a question that I had, which is, let's say you have a Latinx artist that, if you talked about this process of artivism, right? Of artivists where Latinx, cultural producers are not just engaging in the production of art, as a sort of aesthetic act, but that they're engaging in this sort of politics and this social commentary in these really profound ways. So somebody made a comment about like Lin-Manuel Miranda and how the Hamilton sort of phenomenon, where here he's taking something that's very, sacrosanct in American sort of history, and engaging in social commentary by just like messing with it as much as possible. But I'm wondering how does social commentary, political engagement affect Latinx artists as they sort of try to move within this market, right? That seems really bent on excluding them, invisibilizing them, keeping them out in many ways.
Well, but it's also one of the things that I knew would happen would be that Latinx artists may be picked up and may be popularized and may be commodified, right? And one of the key elements of racialization is understanding that both invisibilizing and commodifying are part of the same process, right? Are part of the same racialization. Is that both of them are one in the same, that you may, after the invisibilization, now that if there may be a commodification, right? There's a packaging and there's a hypervisibility, but also in a particular artist in a particular way, right? So it's kind of part of that trend, and we have to be very careful and not say that, oh, well, now Latinx artists are in and that's the end of, because that's a temporal thing, and you also want to highlight what type of art, right? Is it figurative art, right? That is more commodifiable. Is it particular themes, particular topics, right? That become coded as Latino topics, right? Conversation with abstract artists, right? Raise issues about the fact that if you're an abstract artist, right, you're seen as a white artist, as this kind of penchant for narratives and topics that would seem more Latinx, because if you're going to go there, people need to know that these are Latinx artists. So there's a lot of conversations around that, also around the particular ways in which, the particular themes, as we know in our community, right, that is fetishized around particular themes. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think the key element is to be very careful with that, and also that emphasis on on the one artist. Oh, they made it, and forget that our community, 18% of the population is Latinx. So I want to see not just like Lin Miranda, por favor, right? We want to see Latinx and also people of color in all segments of life, and not make an issue of it, right? Because it's so normal, right? That we have Latinx artists because they are part of our community, African-American artists, BIPOP artists. Imagine if we had a really rich representative roster, and not only in the visual arts, but in the media, right? Let's talk about, right, television. Let's talk about what you see in media. Let's talk about our music. Let's talk about, and that's really the issue, right? It's hopefully this book will, when people read this, they will think about their own spaces, whether it's journalism, publishing, media, anthropology departments, right?
Yeah.
And ask those same questions that I ask from dealers and our historians in museums.
Yeah, I also think that the point you make is really important around racialization, right? That just highlighting one person in the community isn't inclusion, isn't equitable practice, right? Like, just because Bad Bunny's everywhere doesn't mean,
oh my God,
Tego Calderon is right, or any of the other. I'm thinking about you in Puerto Rico, but also at large in academia, right? That just because you have one body, one person in a place as supposed to be representative of whatever diversity or inclusion practice, that's not systemic, right? It's not a whole cell change of things.
And one of the things that I loved more about the artists I saw was how community they were, how oriented, and I love that. I love seeing artists curate shows, because since there are no curators that pick them up, there are a lot of artists are doing that role, right? They're becoming curators, they're writing about other artists, they're selling the work of other artists. And that's so powerful, you know, when you're excluded from these spaces and you begin to take roles to fill the voids left by an ecosystem that doesn't see you. And I love that kind of community orientation, that artists were able to open up doors for others. And I think that that's so important in our economy, and anywhere we're doing is, whatever we're doing is be that force that create opportunities for others. That's what we have to be doing.
Yeah. Well, I think I really appreciated being able to be in conversation with you. I will recommend that everyone that's interested in Latinx issues, in Latinx art, pick up a copy of this book, check it out. And like I said at the beginning, if you don't have at least a shelf full of Arlene's books, you need to
At
catch
least
up.
Latinos Inc., right? Latinos
Uh-huh.
Inc. That's the one that I have seen students use generations, and that's how I gauge how old I feel, depending on how young are the people or older the people that say, "Oh, I read it in undergraduate." So,
Mhm.
and by the way, thank you everybody who stayed with us, and Santiago for the invitation, and the
Mhm.
Southwest Studies Center, and everyone who gets to listen to these words today.
Mhm. Thank you, Arlene. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hope everyone has a great evening.